The rain should have been a mercy. It washed the grit from my skin and the city's dust from the stone. It made the lanterns bloom like small, captive moons. Instead, it felt like an accusation, each drop a cold, patient finger tapping against my ribs. Ardent Hollow wrapped itself in fog the way some people wrap themselves in prayers. The town believed in rituals, sweeping thresholds, leaving bread for street ghosts, and in the usefulness of not asking too many questions. I learned to answer the questions the Hollow asked of me. Which tankard goes to which table? Who gets the thin stew with the bruised carrot? Which stories required a coin, and which deserved only a shake of the head? My name is Elowen Ward. I wore my life like an apron, its string tied tight around a narrow waist. The Gilded Thorn belonged to men who traded in ledgers and favors. To me, it belonged the way a scar owns the skin beneath. I knew the tavern's bones, where a board would catch a heel, which pewter cup would sing if you struck it, which corner swallowed both coin and conscience without complaint. There is a kind of safety in knowing a room's faults. You can avoid them the way you avoid the spots on your hands that still remember heat. Even so, I never felt wholly of the Hollow. Some mornings, a mirror in the attic, cracked and honest, showed a light behind my pupils, an amber ember like the dying of a far-off sun. Sometimes the taste of iron woke me, while the rest of the town still dreamt, a metallic note sitting heavy on my tongue that made me watch other people's hands as if they might hide knives. My mother had not named these things. She kept her secrets folded in her palm like a coin. She worked the loom, hummed without words, and died with that hush between her lips. I learned to swallow questions with my bread. That evening, the tavern thrummed with the comfortable noises of survival. Laughter that hid debts, a fiddler pulling a tune thin enough to skin a soul, the low argument of merchants over a map. The hearth was a generous liar, promising warmth it gave grudgingly. Leaks in the rafters made polite pockets of rain, and we joked about how the thorn offered the best of small discomforts. We moved in rhythms. Take the order, set down the plate, smooth a napkin for a widow at the table. Life at the thorn closed on itself like a pocket, complete with holes to count. The door opened and the room listened. It is an odd thing, how a single presence changes the gravity of a place. Chairs stopped scraping. Voices dulled as if someone had drawn a cloth between the world and the hearth. The air folded, and in that fold I felt, sudden as a blade, the odd warmth of attention. He entered not with the pomp of a lord, but with the peculiar ease of someone who has walked alone for a very long time and learned how to make solitude look like command. He did not wear the trappings of myth. He wore black the way a shadow wears itself, a second skin that drank light rather than reflected it. The cloth around his shoulders swallowed the candle's glow. Even the candle seemed ashamed of its small flame near him. He moved with the careful steps of someone who had spent many years removing himself from danger, and in doing so had learned precisely where danger liked to hide. The people nearest the door straightened as if the old stories had been spoken aloud, a name that scraped throats like old wool. He took the table at the back, close enough to the hearth to be warmed, far enough that the shadows kept some of their mischief. With him sat a pale woman whose fingers trembled around a napkin, and two older faces tightened into polite rigidity. Silk whispered. Forks made small, nervous noises. The room held its breath. Serving someone of that station is an exercise in pretending not to notice how pretenses tear. I set a bowl of broth before the pale woman and a goblet of wine before the man in black. He did not lift it. He picked at a seam on his sleeve as if measuring the patience of his cloth. He watched me the way a careful reader watches a page, not impatient but intent. The ale slipped the ordinary way. A snag of my sleeve, a cup overfull, the amber liquid skittering across well-worn wood. The thorn lived on small accidents. We called them life. The glass cracked like a small bell. A merchant laughed too loud. I bent to clean, thinking only of scalded palms or the barkeep's brief, habitual scold. Cold bit my fingertips, sharp, a little more than a sting. I lifted my hand and saw a thin ribbon of red feathering at the skin. The sight of blood always feels intimate, an urgency that hollows the tongue. For a moment the world narrowed to that small, burning circle. Rain outside turned to smear. He inhaled. Not because he smelled ale or stew, but because the air itself had altered with the copper note from my palm. The motion was so slight I might have convinced myself I saw nothing at all. Yet the chairs at the next table stiffened, the fiddler's bow faltered. He stepped forward with a measured dignity, and when he set his hand over mine, it was like being touched by winter from the inside, the cold that carries memory of stone and snow. He did not speak the hungry, thirsty lines of Thales. Instead, he observed, a scholar making notes. His thumb brushed my skin and the world tilted. There are stories of creatures who devour warmth and light. Fangs, velvet capes, theatrical moonlight. The truth was quieter. When his eyes found mine, the color inside them did not hold cruelty but recognition, older than gossip, older than fear. An animal thing uncoiled in me, a memory of chains and iron, and it recoiled with the knowledge of an old dread. I made a small, surprised noise that might have been a laugh if it were not so fragile. I should have stepped back, but his hold steadied rather than bound. Around us, patrons whispered like a low wind. The Vampire King, they said, a name that scraped like a shard of glass. I had heard the market tales about Varek of the North, tower, blood debt, hunger that outlasts kingdoms, but those were warnings told to make children obedient. To see him eat soup was a different terror. He tasted the broth, set the spoon down with a deliberate calm, then watched me again as if I were a problem to be solved. My nerves thrummed with the pull of his look, a tightness that made breaths too sharp. A warmth and a fear braided together in my chest, an ache I thought I had learned to keep under wraps. Then the whisper came from behind me, small and mothwing soft, and it changed the room's laws. "Run now before he sees what you are," said the other waitress, an ordinary woman I had passed many times in the mornings, hair tied back in a practical knot. The words should have been a jest, the thorns' humor skewed dark. Instead, they landed as if thrown like a stone and sank heavy into whatever shallow piece we clung to. I thought at once that she was playing the town's taste for drama. Then I saw how her hands had stilled mid-wash, how the water in her basin trembled like a held breath. Her gaze hardened like wet mortar. The pale woman at the table pressed her knuckles white into her napkin. A hush moved over the room as if the world were waiting for a verdict. Something in the man at the table altered. He rose with a quiet so severe it might have been an eclipse. His face did not change. If anything, it became curiously gentle, but his eyes shifted into something that mapped and pinned. Recognition is a dangerous thing. It turns familiar streets into labyrinths. Panic did not arrive in waves. It tore, my legs obeyed before my brain could offer reasons. I dropped the tray. Wood and crock clattered, a discordant percussion to the new hymn of alarm. Gasps rose like a tide. The other waitress had already vanished into the press, as if ink in water. The thorn became a blur of faces and accusations, and the sudden algebra of who might profit from my misfortune. I fled into the rain without my coat. The cold hit me like the truth. It bit my lungs and pried open the seams of my breath. Lantern light smeared the alley into streaks of orange and white. I ran not only to escape him, though that was urgent, but because a whisper had made my blood into something worth hunting. In Ardent Hollow, problems had teeth. Footsteps multiplied, then thinned. A shout cleaved the rain. I ran by memory of the town, which alley held a stack of crates to vault, where a stray dog might be sleeping and how to skirt it. The shadows seemed to congeal with a will, reaching with a slow patience that made me feel observed by the dark itself. Something followed, patient and tide-like, the kind of following that does not shout but waits until you tire. I did not dare look back until I rounded the bridge that arched like a broken rib over the canal. When I did, there he stood in the doorway of the thorn, a dark figure carved into rain. The distance kept him honest. The bridge kept me from the immediacy of a command. Rain ran across his face but did not mar the geometry of him. For a heartbeat, he looked unhuman, too precise, as if sculpture had been mistaken for flesh. He did not move to follow. He watched. Watching felt larger than the town around us. The rain mocked us with small, ordinary violence while we held a scene that seemed older than the stones beneath our boots. My palm ached where the cut had been. The copper taste rolled on my tongue. The whisper had given me a direction but not safety. It had not told me the price of being seen, nor the appetite of a king who had learned to wait. I stood on that bridge soaked and small, and felt, at last, how tightly my life had been held by a thread someone else had knotted. The forest outside Ardent Hollow had the habit of pretending to forget things. Roots kept their secrets, moss swallowed footsteps, and rewove the story of your passing into a quiet hum. Elowen slid between trunks that smelled of loam and old rain, breath visible in the air like a small, angry spirit. Her clothes were plastered to her skin, the cut on her palm pulsed as if it had its own heartbeat. The thorn's heat had been a poor substitute for comfort. Out here, the trees made room for truth. They did not pretend to be anything other than trees. Night creatures woke and resettled around her. An owl spoke in a language older than her fear, and something far off dragged itself across dead leaves. She let herself lie down in a hollow, the damp of earth soaking through her skirts. Exhaustion tried to take her first, then memory, the taste of the man's breath, the coldness of his thumb on her skin, the look that had unspooled across the thorn as if it were a map. She closed her eyes and a woman came to her like a half-remembered song. "Child of the bound blood," the woman said, though she had not a mouth. The voice threaded through dream and waking, her mother, older than all the afternoon griefs. Some woman with hair that flowed like river reeds, a face worn by salt and seasons. The words fit like a glove she had never known she owned. Elowen's breath snagged. The scent of iron rose in her throat. She reached for the memory and found it slippery. Dreams are poor historians. They hold truth in the shape of riddles. In the dream, hands reached for her, not cruel, not gentle, just seeking. The woman's fingers brushed her forehead, and a flash of cold ran through Elowen's chest. Images of altars, of a low chant in a ruined tongue, of a child wrapped in linen that smelled of myrrh. She woke with those images still carved inside her, and the hunger for answers pressed like a fist at her ribs. She had barely risen when the sound of movement cut clean through the woods. Someone was careful. Not furtive, not unpracticed, measured, like a predator who had practiced patience. She raised her head and saw, framed between two trunks, the man from the thorn. Even at a distance, he seemed too composed for the night. Moonlight made him an outline of economy and purpose. "You should not hide in the open," he said. The voice was a thing she could not have named, and yet it fit the shape of him. He did not approach the way a hunter approaches prey. His steps were closer to those of a scholar who has come to a library and asks only for time. Up close he smelled of old books and wet stone. "Why are you here?" Elowen asked, though she knew the man better by the tremor in her voice than by the words themselves. "Because you ran," he said simply, "and because you cut yourself." He lifted his hand as if the cut were a small, shared joke, "and because your blood reached further than the thorn." She remembered the thorn in sharp fragments, the other waitress's whisper, the fall of her tray, the view through the bridge. Now, under a canopy of indifferent leaves, the things that had seemed like accidents looked designed. "Who are you?" she asked, and the name she half expected to hear lurked in the spaces between the syllables, a rumor like static. "Varek," he said, "Varek of the North." The title sat between them like an old coin. But names matter little. People give them to make themselves feel in charge. "You're the king." It was a statement that tasted of soot. It was also a child's question. "Why are you here, king of the night, beneath my roof of leaves?" "I am a man who found you," he corrected. "A man who noticed you." That last word was neither tender nor cruel. It was an observation and an ultimatum. There was a silence that rearranged their breaths. When he stepped closer, the forest did something that made her skin prickle. The leaves seemed to bow. The world, she thought with a small, terrified honesty, had a way of bending to him as if he were a quiet god. She could have run again, could have fled deeper into the bracken and let the night cover her, but a part of her felt the foolishness of that option. For reasons she would not have admitted under oath, she wanted to know why his eyes had gone that particular color when they held her in the thorn. "Half-born," he said after a time, and the word was a stone thrown into the water of her mind. "You are neither wholly of the dawn nor purely of the dusk. It makes you strange to both." What does that mean?" Her voice was smaller than she planned. "It means your blood is not common," he said. "It means you have something in you that the old songs name in many ways and modern men prefer to forget. It means you have choices that will not be simple." He paused. It means you could be very dangerous if you wanted to be. His gaze was sharp, and there was hunger in it most people would have called metaphor. She felt the arc of something older than either of them pulled taut between them. Curiosity, fear, the first intimations of a thread that could fasten or sever. His presence was less a threat than an opening, like a door to a dark room where everything that mattered might already be laid out. You could kill me, Elowen said, because the sentence lived in her ribs. Sometimes killing is easier than answering, he said. Sometimes it is also a cruelty to be avoided. He looked at her palm and then at her face. Run and you will waste whatever power you possess. Stay and you may become a weapon or a savior. Both are dangerous. You should have left me at the thorn, she said, more angry than frightened. You should have let them. Let them do what? He interrupted. Hunt you, fear you, sell you to superstition. He shook his head as if he found the notion distasteful. No, I wanted to know what you would do with yourself if given a choice. There was something maddeningly simple about his honesty. It left her raw. You call me half-born and mean something else, Elowen said. The words tasted like iron. Do you know what I am? Do you know what my mother was? No, he admitted, but I have read of things that may fit. He crouched and looked at her eye to eye, a movement that erased the old distinctions of height and power. I have learned enough to know you are bound by bloodlines that do not end. There are old names for what lives in you, names that were proper nouns rather than curses once upon a time. Names that sound like legend because men do not see them often enough to call them facts. She felt absurdly like a coin on a table, examined for its worth. Questions that had always felt private, wrenching, and tender were now catalogued and weighed by a man who seemed to have all the time in the world. Why keep me alive? She asked. If you need my blood, you could take it. He smiled then, a quick motion that showed an old fatigue. If I take it, the curse ends or it does not. If it ends, who is to say what will rise in its place? If it does not, I have robbed you of everything. There is cruelty in certainty. His voice dropped. And, Elowen, he said her name as if tasting the shape of it, you are not a thing to be decided upon without being asked. She had no answer for that except the way her throat closed. He rose, leaving a faint chill in the hollow where he had been. You will not remain safe in the forest, he said. You will not remain safe anywhere near the thorn. People see what they fear and then make crowns of it. Hide if you wish. Learn if you can. But when the night sets a clock, choices are made rapidly. He left her then with a look that could have been a promise or a threat. She watched him go, and the forest seemed to close like a fist behind him. When she finally moved, the dream words swam at the edges of her mind. Child of the bound blood. Half-born. An inheritance that smelled faintly of funeral wax and myrrh. She went to the chapel ruins the next morning because ruins were honest. The chapel had been a place where her mother had lit small candles and said a prayer that was half superstition and half hope. Those pillars were now moss-swathed spokes, and the altar was a drift of broken stone and ivy. The place held the kind of silence that keeps secrets not by design, but out of exhaustion. It seemed to ground her by reminding her that everything falls eventually. The past was only a ruin that did not always want to be cared for. She intended to look for a sign. She intended to find a scrap of cloth, a jagged inscription, something that linked her to the woman in her dreams. But what she found instead was a man bent over a stack of brittle scrolls, candlelight making him look like a figure from an older book. He did not startle when she came near. He did not ruffle with the usual human irritation. You seek answers, he observed. His voice was dry like old parchment. Most people come here to remember and then leave. You come to retrieve. Who are you? Elowen asked. He looked older than the thorn's barkeep, but younger than the stones. Thane Durrell, he said. I tend to bad books and worse truths. We are an unromantic pair. He smiled briefly in a way that suggested he found his own joke tasteless. He had a scholar's steadiness, the sort that makes you feel like the world might be explained away if you took all the time necessary. You read about me? She asked. I read about many things, he replied. The Crimson Prophecy, for example. Elowen's heartbeat thudded as if a hand rested on her sternum. She had heard of prophecies in the market, old rhymes meant to sell loaves and entertain children. but crimson prophecy carried a weight beyond barroom entertainment. He took one of the rolls and unrolled it with a reverence that felt almost like prayer. A blood born of both mortal and eternal, Thane read, shall end the curse of night or drown the world in it. The words were blunt and terrible. Elowen felt, for the first time, like a bell being rung for reasons she did not yet understand. You mean me? Her voice was small. You fit the description, Thane said. There are few who do. Many believe the line was extinguished long ago. Others say it was never more than a story meant to frighten lovers away from dangerous unions. But lore has its teeth. The more people who fear a thing, the more eager some will be to make it real for their own ends. He set the scroll down with care. Your blood could be the blade that frees them from their curse, or the fuel that sets a new fire. That is what it says. It does not tell who decides which happens. And which is more likely? Her laugh was brittle. It depends on who holds you and what they need, Thane said. Some vampires see your line as a weapon. Some humans see you as a pestilence to be purged before it blooms. He regarded her for a long moment. You must understand one thing. Prophecy is not a map. It is a warning. People will try to use you to justify what they already intend. Elowen felt a spinning sensation, as if the world had tilted on some new axis. So I'm to be hunted by both sides, she said, and the sentence was not a question. Likely, Thane agreed, but perhaps not inevitable. The prophecy speaks of ending and drowning. The variable, it seems, is the actor. That is where choice, a dangerous word, enters. How do I learn? She asked. How do I know what I am? You study what is left of your line, he said. You seek people who remember without the fear of currency. You speak to those who think in knowledge rather than in kings. He hesitated. And you find allies because enemies will find you without trouble. Will you help me? Elowen asked, worn thin at the edges. Thane's smile was not unsympathetic. I will if I judge you true, and if my curiosity keeps me from more comfortable scholarly pursuits. He packed the scroll away and rose, his bones making soft complaints. We begin in small things. Spells are often gestures, not miracles. Bloodlines are habit as well as inheritance. Begin with what you can. Learn your mother's prayers, hear the names she whispered, find where she lived and what she kept. The past is a ledger. We will read it together. Outside, the wind lifted and the ruins sounded like a chorus. The world did not promise ease, but it offered process. Elowen felt less like a flotsam tossed about and more like a cart with broken wheels. It could move onward with help. Thane left her with a list of names and a map of where to find them, small things. An old midwife in a coastal village, a monk who specialized in minor genealogies, a woman who sold funeral spices and remembered births as if they were landmarks. The work would be slow. It would also be dangerous because curiosity is breath to those who stalk truth. She returned to the thorn to gather what she could and maybe to see if the man who called himself Varek had any follow-up. The tavern smelled of stew and secrets. The thorn had not forgotten her flight. It hummed with a new current of interest. Eyes tracked her as she moved. She felt, in the small places where fabric meets skin, the map of being watched again. Days later, she stood before the gates of the castle beyond the gray ridge, the place of towers like the spines of sea beasts the market rhymers had long described. Castle stones kept their own weather. They did not gossip like taverns. The drawbridge lowered with a groan that sounded like an animal shifting its weight. Guards with pale faces and steady knives ushered her in, as if the act of entering might settle something about her. The castle was a series of corridors that creaked with memory. Candles made halos and then retreated. Portraits watched and never blinked. Mirrors were draped in black silk in some places, as though the family wished to starve the glass of reflection. Elowen moved through halls that smelled of old civility and the sharp tang of iron. It was opulent and stern, a palace of vows that had been sharpened into a fortress. Varek received her with the same calm that had marked him at the Thorn. He did not look surprised to see her again, as if he had invited her all along. He led her to a dining chamber that looked like a sanctum. Long table, tall chairs, candles burning despite the hour, their wells like small, patient suns. Lyra sat at the head, fragile as a porcelain bird and twice as brittle. Her fingers trembled over her goblet. Around them, nobles murmured like a chorus of restrained storms, their gossip a low and dangerous hum. "You came," Lyra said. Her voice was not venomous but edged with a wounded surprise. "Why? I was invited," Elowen said, which was true. Varek had been the inviter, but his motives remained as opaque as ever. Dinner was a dance of diplomatic niceties. Men and women traded toasts that meant nothing and made threats that could be folded into silk. Conversations folded over the same worries, their fortunes, the stability of the northern marches, the rumors of rebels and bloodlines. Varek watched the room with the patient detachment of someone cataloging an upcoming storm. He leaned toward Elowen across the table for a moment, and then, with the ease of a practiced secret, brushed his fingers against the cut on her palm beneath the tablecloth. The contact was slight, a postcard-sized covenant. Elowen felt the warmth of his fingers through fabric and the lift of something tender and terrible, a vow that was not declared with words but with touch. In that quiet graze, she felt both ordained and damned. Around them, conversation continued, clinking silver, the scrape of cutlery, but the world tightened on that small, defiant tether. She and Varek spoke in glances. When she met Lyra's eyes, there was an animal fear there and a small, rational calculation that made her look younger than she had moments before. The room was politics and teeth. Elowen felt like an interloper at both tables, caught between the hunger for what she might be and the fear of what others intended to do with that hunger. Later, when the map of the night's maneuvers had been drawn and the nobles retired with soft, satisfied smiles, the castle shuddered with the first violent sound. The signal of attack. A cry sharp and wrong came from the ramparts, followed by the clatter of feet and the thud of armor. The castle's outer world had remembered conflict. Vampiric rebels poured over the walls like shadows with teeth, their forms quick and terrible. They were not the civilized horror of courtly tailies, they were weather with claws. The dining chamber erupted into its own small war. Candles toppled, glass fractured into starlight. Nobles cried for their guards as if the call might stitch armor to flesh. Elowen's blood answered the call before her mind did. Something rose in her, a light like the inside of a furnace, the taste of power in her mouth. It burst from her in a way that had nothing to do with intention, a flare of heat that slapped the faces of attackers nearest her. They reeled back as if struck by the sun, their purpose scattering into flayed confusion. Varek's face changed in that flash. A look of something like horror and reverence passed across his features. He moved with an agility that made the room small and large at once, defending her with a ferocity that seemed to rewrite his quiet into violent protection. They fought side by side. The violence braided around something raw and intimate, an involuntary duet. He saved her from the teeth of a rebel who had leapt with the aim of claiming her blood. He struck like the end of a world. When the skirmish waned like wind after a storm, blood and candle wax mingled on the floorboards. Nobles whimpered. The castle's stones held witness. In the aftermath, in a corridor lit by smeared torches, they stood breathless, shoulder to shoulder. He looked at her with all the questions he had not asked, all the choices he had not yet offered. "Your blood," he said hoarsely, "is not a myth." "You knew," she whispered. "I suspected," he admitted. "But seeing it, that is different." "You could have taken it," she said. The accusation lived in her mouth like a bitter pill. "I could have," he said. "I did not." He paused. "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than make you into something you do not choose to be." The words were heavy. He reached for her hand again, and she allowed it, though the memory of Lyra's pale look made the touch a blade. In that contact, she felt the thrum of possibility and the weight of doom in equal measure. The court demanded answers. The nobles convened, their faces the masks of someone keeping a ledger of favors and debts. Lyra's fear went sharp as a knife and turned to something darker. Jealousies braided with the terror of being replaced. In a moment of panic, and perhaps of sabotage, she rose to speak at a gathering intended to reassure. Her voice, small and reedy, declared Elowen's half-born state with hysterical clarity and a venom that tasted of fear. The assembly snapped like an animal. Creeds were recited in the subtlest of ways. The demand for Elowen's death was made with the softest of words because cruelty in silk is the most certain. The nobles saw in her the easy resolution of a problem. The court wanted the prophecy silenced. Varek did not yield. He tore at the fabric of his own composed manner. In a motion so swift it shocked the room, he struck down an advisor who would speak of execution as if it were a footnote. Metal flashed. Blood sprayed like an obscene promise. There was a crunch of order. He did what he had not always done. Chose the woman tied to his fate over the convenience of his title. Lyra and her family fled in the wake of the tumult, their carriage wheels beating an unsteady rhythm down the lane. They pointed back with fingers that smelled of accusation. They called the king mad, they called him weak, and they called Elowen a witch. The throne room, once a place of polite threats, had become a battlefield of loyalties. Thane reappeared like an answer sent by providence or irony. Elowen could not tell which. His eyes registered the violence and then steady interest. He touched her sleeve. "The blood moon rises," he said. "The choice must be made tonight." Elowen felt the night fold into her, into a pocket of darkness small and unbearable, and she understood the math of survival and sacrifice. She could not remain the tavern's apprentice, nor could she slip back into the anonymity of a life in which shadow stalked every corner. The prophecy had narrowed like a pair of shears. The hour was near when actions would be definitive, and no amount of hiding would undo what had been seen. She looked at Varek then, a man who had shown her both mercy and a desire she could not name. He had saved her with weapons and with a gentleness that frightened her. He held, in his hands, the means to end the curse that had haunted the North for generations. He also held the desire that perhaps, if she were willing to give of herself, their fates might be entwined in something resembling love. The castle hummed at the edges with a readiness for war. Outside, the shadows of rebels gathered like storm clouds remembering themselves. Inside, choices coagulated into decisions. Elowen felt the thin thread of destiny pull taut between the promise of freedom and the weight of obligation. The blood moon would not ask politely whose side she chose. It would make the choice for her if she failed to decide the night the blood moon rose. The castle felt like an animal bracing to spring. Stones remembered every footstep, and the great hall, designed for feasts that once summoned laughter like a tide, had been hollowed into a place of watchfulness. Servants moved like shadows that knew better than to notice the shapes of those who waited in the wings. Torches guttered in sconces, their smoke curling into the rafters like small, bitter prayers. Outside the ramparts, the rebels gathered in ragged lines, a dark muscle under the sky. Within, old banners swayed though no wind touched them. They moved as if memory itself breathed. Elowen stood at a narrow window in a corridor that smelled of iron and old incense. The moon hung swollen and unnatural, a bruise of red hung high and monstrous over the land. It was the color of fresh meat and of ferric truth. The castle held its breath as it watched the sky. The air tasted of copper and expectation. Every living thing seemed to feel the shift, even the silent portraits whose painted eyes had watched too long. She had not slept. In the hours since dawn had fallen, the ember of her power had flared and dimmed like an unsteady lantern. Now, with the moon's blood pouring across the world, something inside her had the steady pull of an ocean. Her pulse thudded in the hollow of her throat, synchronous with the faint, distant drum of hooves. The cut on her palm, once an accident and a shame, hummed with a warmth that was not quite pain and not quite blessing. Her breaths came sharp and measured, as if each might be used like a tool. Thane had returned at dusk with notes scrawled on brittle paper and eyes that pinched with concern. "Tonight will show what you are," he had said, and his hands had trembled as he offered a small charm that smelled faintly of rosemary and soot. "The prophecy is not a lover of half measures." He spoke of old rites and a ledger of names. He spoke of choices as if they were things that could be tallied. His knowledge steadied her like a cane, useful and somewhat sharp. Varek came and went like a weather pattern, one moment present with the precision of a sovereign in his hall, the next a shadow on the parapet. He was quieter than the storm around them, his composure carved out of a long training in patience. At times she watched him and remembered the way his hand had steadied her at the thorn, the onion-skin gentleness in which he had brushed a seam of fabric. Other times she remembered the way the nobles had feared him, the way stories curved their tongues at his name. "You should leave," he had told her earlier that night in a corridor that smelled of old wine and colder promises. He said it simply, as if the choice could be packaged and handed to her like a tray. "My presence here will not save you from what men will do when they panic." "I can't," she said, and meant it in a way that surprised both of them. "I have to know who I am. If I run, I will only be something other people fear." He touched her softly on the arm in that bare, steady way he had, a touch that had once steadied her at the thorn and now felt like a vow. "I recognized your blood the moment you bled," he confessed then, his voice a low thing that shifted like ice. "It is the same note I smelled once, centuries ago, when a woman bent her head over a cradle and laughed at the moon. I thought it impossible. I thought the line ended. I was wrong." His eyes, which had always seemed the color of winter standing water, softened with something like sorrow. "My heart, if such a thing is not completely meaningless to what I have become, tore when I thought you were another incarnation of that woman. I have been living beneath a debt that has no tally but memory." Elowen's breath caught. "Your heart," she echoed, and she could not tell if she was asking for an explanation or offering a pardon. He bowed his head, as if answering a confession carved before him. "Long ago, I loved someone who was a bright thing and foolish in the way of mortals. I was not wise then. I killed what I could no longer bear to lose, and in that violence the gods carved a curse into me. I was given life without end and hunger for what keeps mortal warmth. A punishment meant to teach me the cost of my pride. I thought time might soften it. It did not. I bled with regret in the quiet hours. When I smelled you, when the same note of the blood that had once tethered me to something human brushed my face, something I had sewn shut opened. I would have turned away rather than wake that memory. I tried. I failed." He looked up at her, and in that glance was a request and a fear. "Leave. Live as the mortal you can become. Let me keep what remains of my curse to myself." Her answer was a refusal and a promise tangled into one. "If I am part of the ending of your curse, I will not be used like a tool." The words were a steel line. "If there is to be an ending, I will face it with eyes open." "You make my choices uglier," he said, but there was no cruelty in it, only the ache of inevitability. He placed a hand over hers for a moment, and she felt the solid, mortal weight of it despite the history of his immortality. "Then we will choose together," he said, and the sentence sounded like the beginning of a prayer she had not learned the words to. The castle prepared as if it were a beast tensing its muscles. Arrows were notched, blades were oiled, and the servants closed doors with a soft, careful finality. Voices in corridors sounded like arguments with fate. The rebels clung to the outer walls like a memory of wrongs that would not stop whispering. Within the stones, the court waited as if holding its fists closed to keep the world intact. The sky bled deeper. The moon hung, swollen and grave, and the whole land seemed to tilt toward its pull. Elowen felt the pull in her marrow, the way a tide responds to a moon and cannot help the physics it loves. Her vision warmed at the edges. When she blinked, small suns and cinders swam behind her lids. Then, without fanfare, her irises changed. It was not so much a transformation as the removal of a veil. Her eyes, once ordinary and shadowed, flamed with a crimson gold light that made the candles seem pale. The glow was not lantern bright, but it was luminous in the way a core is luminous, something that came from within and did not pretend to be anything else. Thane whooped once, more like a noise of relief than joy. "So it begins," he murmured, with the scholarly awe of one who watches a theory prove itself. "The line wakes." Varek's face was a landscape of pain and hope when he saw it. He reached for her as if to hold the world steady. "You are more than I imagined," he whispered, "and more terrifying." There was no sermon that could have prepared them for the hour. The rebels attacked with a sound like a harvest of broken things. They came in waves, battering at gates, testing walls, their banners a tide of ragged black. Inside, certain vassals and nobles who feared the change sought to seize the advantage of the chaos. The courtyard became a conflation of loyalties and blood. The castle, which had held centuries of peace through fear and law, breathed the first honest air of war since its stones had cooled from original laying. The dining hall, the place where oaths had been eaten and treaties broken over wine, became the arena for the world's convulsions. The great double doors crashed inward like the flayed jaws of some enormous beast. Rebels poured into the room, faces masked by desperation and the sheen of fevered conviction. They wielded makeshift weapons and ancient grudges. The nobles, who had once sat with their knives hidden like manners, now opened their hands to grasp for swords that would not protect them from the shape of what the prophecy suggested. Candles toppled when bodies collided. Flakes of plaster rained like old snow. The chandelier, an iron spider strung with crystals and candlelight, swayed and then, with a sick, inevitable shudder, broke free of its chain. It fell like a constellation pulled from the sky. The candles exploded into tiny, furious suns. Wax and flame cascaded in a shower that smelled of char and old silk. Where flame licked, blood gleamed like polished rubies. The hall became a painting of chaos, a riot of cloth and metal under the moon's cruel, red dominion. Elowen and Varek fought together as if bound by something older than lovers, the muscle memory of survival and the necessity of protecting the fragile center in each other. He moved with the lethal grace of someone who had been taught warfare by centuries. She moved with a wild, untutored cunning that turned fear into a kind of speed. Their actions wove around each other, steps echoing, blows matched, a dance with the cadence of a prayer that begged for mercy and got none. They reached the center of the hall where nobles had made their stand. Lyra stood there, a pale figure with a look that had been braided by jealousy and despair. Her eyes were glassy with decision, and in her hand was a knife that had been kept for show, until now. The hamlet of her composure broke, replaced by the desperate geometry of someone who would not survive what she feared. She lunged not at Elowen, but at Varek with a swift, clean motion born of hatred and pleading. The blade sank, an engine of small finality, into Varek's side. The hall convulsed as if struck. Time became a taut string and then a snapped thread. Varek's expression shifted in the particular way of someone who had expected betrayal, and yet found himself taxed by its intimacy. His hand came up instinctively, and then slid to the wound. The color of his life, which had always been a strange, thick dark before, now ran richer for the first time in ages. Elowen's scream cut the air, a note that was not only animal but an invocation. Pain and gravity collided. She threw herself across Varek in a motion that was half surrender and half prayer. The rebels faltered at the sight, caught between their hatred of what they called the curse-bearer and the sudden, intimate humanity of the blood that now stained his shirt. He choked on the wound with a noise that tore something open in him. For an immortal, the sensation of mortality is an odd honesty, sudden and immediate. Varek's knees weakened. He looked at Elowen with a clarity that was almost childlike, and the world narrowed to the small, crucial space between breaths. She did not care that the castle burned or the moon bled. She did not care that those who had hunted her might now see her as the same salvation they once desired. She cared only for the man whose name had been a bruise and whose hands had steadied her when she was falling. Without deliberation, she did what stories had prepared her for, but nothing in her living had trained her to do. She pressed her lips to the wound and drank. It was not the dramatic feast of vampire lore, the soft, satisfied smacking of hunger, but a desperate, precise drinking, like someone taking in the only map that could point home. Varek's blood was all copper and heat, an old constellational burn. The act was not sensual as the tavern songs suggest. It was sacrament and surgery mixed. She drew until his breath steadied, until the bleed slowed, until the sound of his heart, ancient and rhythmic, adjusted as if learning a new law. Something in that exchange shifted with the inevitability of a tide changing course. The castle's panic became background noise to the intimate thunder between them. She felt her own power convene around the act, as if drinking the life in his wound bound them with another currency than prophecy. Sorrow, atonement, and a love that smelled of brimstone and candle wax. The magic did not whisper a polite assent, it raked and rewrote. Varek's eyes were wide, not with shock but with recognition. "You bind me," he breathed, the words ragged and tremulous, "with what you have and with what you will become." "I bind you with truth," she said. Her voice was low and broke like thin ice. "I will not let you be a thing of suffering. The curse is a patient, complicated thing. It is not a single knot you untie with one strong hand. It is braided into small habits and the bones of the land. As she drank, Elowen felt the weight of the centuries in his blood, regrets mineralized into taste, a hunger tempered into an ache. Her own blood answered back, mingling in a way that felt both gentle and combustible. The air around them shimmered with an impossible heat, the moonlight refracted into something paler. The rebels faltered, nobles wept, and the candlelight around them guttered as if the world itself waited for the law to be rewritten. Then, as if in response to a private accord between a savior and a damned man, the light around Varek, once cool and distant, softened. The rigid edges that had lived on his face for generations eased like a stone loosened from a wall. His skin paled, and then warmed with a texture she had seen on mortal hands. Fine lines, small veins under thin skin, a softness of mortality that had been taken and then given back in the same breath. The curse, that old, iron law, began to dissolve like frost in sunlight. But there was cost. Magic keeps what it bargains for. The crimson prophecy had promised an ending or a drowning. The ending never arrives without a debt. As Varek's breath evened and the color of living returned to him, Elowen felt the furnace of power in her chest burn down. The hues in her eyes dimmed and then flared with a last, brilliant intensity, the crimson gold answering the moon's last indictment. The warmth that had been a comfort slid into a different register, bone fire that consumes what sustains it. Her fingers trembled in Varek's hair as if to anchor both of them to what they had chosen. "You must go," Varek said hoarsely, his voice now threaded with a fragility that made his earlier centuries of command sound like ornaments. "Please, live. Take this life. Make it count." She laughed, small and wet with tears. "You asked me to leave once," she whispered. "You asked me to spare myself. I cannot leave now. I will not let this be the end you called for." His arms wrapped around her with a strength both mortal and new. He begged the world with his embrace. "I cannot bear this," he murmured. "Take me instead. I will die 1,000 deaths." The gods, if gods pay attention to such small, fierce bargains, offered no new miracles. Elowen felt her skin lose its fullness as if an invisible hand were unbuttoning the world. The warmth that had been her power went into the shape they had made with blood and vows, and what remained was a residue of ash and memory. Her lips left his, pressing once more to his brow, and she smiled, an expression that held both triumph and finality. "You were worth the darkness," she breathed. The words were simple and true, and they stitched something whole out of the torn fabric of their lives. He sobbed then, a sound raw and new, a human sound that would be a novelty in a life otherwise filled with restraint. He begged to follow, to share the fate she had chosen, to lay down his mortal head in whatever grave the work of their reconciled lives might allow. The plea was inefficacious. The choice had been given and the cost specified. The world moved by rules older than the pleas of lovers. She did not die with drama. There was no sudden pillar of light nor pyre of angels. She thinned and then she unmade. Fingers became dust like flour through a sieve. Hair loosened into fine ash that tasted of iron and lavender. Varek held her as the edges of her form frayed into the room's fabric like the end of some meticulously woven cloth. For a long moment he cradled nothing but the air and the weight of a promise kept. When the dust left a faint red smudge on his palm, an imprint that would not fully wash away, he pressed it to his mouth as if to taste the echo of what had been. The castle's din softened. The rebels, stunned by the miracle and the cost, retreated into the night with something like reverence and fear. The war did not end that hour. Shields and swords still had pages to fill, but its shape had changed. A mortal man now wore crowns and choices that must be weighed without the cushion of endlessness. Varek sat on the charred floor of the hall, the burns of battle and the stains of loss a new kind of heraldry. The moon bled until it paled into the color of old milk. The red drain receded, and the world exhaled as if having passed through a fever. The castle, wounded but intact, smelled of smoke and loss and a fervent kind of peace. He pressed his hand, where Elowen's mark still glowed faint and stubborn, against his mouth and then to his heart. He whispered into the empty air the name she had given him in small moments that felt like theft and grace, and in the hush that followed, he understood the long arithmetic of what had passed. He had been given a life and given his mortal heart with its broken edges, and that too was a cruelty and a mercy braided together. Outside, dawn bled into the sky like a cautious promise. The hollow would rebuild in time. The thorn would carry stories in its wood for years. People would say the king had been cured or that a witch had sacrificed herself. Some would call it romance, some madness. Most would frame it as the solution to a problem they could never wholly understand. In the great hall, the final embers of the chandelier smoldered like a fallen constellation. Varek rose slowly, feeling each bone as if it was a new instrument he must learn to play. He walked the corridors like a man returned from an absence he had never wanted. He held in his hand a small pinch of ash in a copper box, a remnant of the woman who had been the end and the beginning of his reckoning. He closed the box and set it on the altar where once he had knelt in penitent darkness. And there, in the hollow of the chapel ruin that smelled faintly of myrrh and rain, he traced the name Elowen as if daring it to be more than memory. He did not sleep that day. He rose a sovereign that wore a human chest with trembling dignity. He kissed the mark on his palm as if to keep from losing her twice. Sometimes, at odd hours when the wind pushed new grief through the stones, he would feel a small, phantom warmth against his skin. The ghost of a touch, a memory like a pulse. He would close his eyes and think of little things she had done. How she laughed when no one looked, how she had folded bread into the hands of a beggar. And in that remembering he found the bones of future good. When the hollow spoke of that night, they whispered of bargains and of virtues and of curses undone. They visited the thorn and murmured at the boards, and they lit small candles at the chapel ruin where once a woman had prayed to no god in particular. The prophecy had been fulfilled in the way prophecies often are, messy, costly, and human in its conclusion. Love had not arrived like a balm but as a ledger, written in equal parts mercy and expense. Varek learned to walk with a lighter step in the months that followed because mortality insists that every step counts. He rebuilt things badly at first, gardens that withered under inexpert hands, laws that read like drafts. He learned to taste wine as a man who knew it would not be eternal. He became kinder where he had once been cruel. Perhaps that was the change the gods had meant. He kept the copper box on a shelf in a small room he never let guests enter. The ashes were only a fraction of what she had been, but they were enough to teach him the contour of his loss. On quiet evenings, he would go to the thorn and stand in the doorway, listening to the clink of tankards and the soft scuff of aprons. Sometimes, once, twice, he thought he saw her in a woman sitting at a corner table, laughing too loudly at a joke. Once, very late, a new waitress hummed an old tavern tune, a lullaby he had never heard her sing but which slid into him like water, and he found himself holding his breath. He would press his thumb to the faint crimson stain on his palm and feel how, in the end, the world had kept its bargain. The curse had been broken. The choice had been made. The cost, like so many coinings of fate, had been paid by a woman who loved and who gave until there was nothing left but an echo. The echo became part of the hollow's nightly sound. A small, persistent memory that even kings must keep in their pockets to remind them who they are when dawn shows them the honest face of life. 5 years had passed since the night the moon bled over Ardent Hollow. The rain still came often, softer now, cleaner somehow, but every storm carried the faint scent of iron, as though the sky itself hadn't forgotten. The once Gothic port town had rebuilt itself from ash and sorrow. New stone stood where the old had burned, though the fog lingered like a memory unwilling to leave. Children played in the streets that had once run red, and the tavern, the Gilded Thorn, stood again, its lanterns glowing gold against the gray. Inside, laughter flowed, mugs clinked, and music hummed low from an old gramophone that skipped on the same melody every few minutes. King Varek Ashborne, no longer vampire king, no longer immortal, sat quietly at a corner table. He wore no crown, no cloak of power, only a threadbare coat and gloves that hid his hands. To the townsfolk, he was just another traveler, though rumors still whispered. The pale man who never smiles, who once ruled the night. He watched the firelight dance in his glass of wine, its crimson reflection almost mocking. He hadn't touched blood in years, yet he could still taste hers. Elowen. The name had become a prayer, a curse, and a ghost all at once. The world believed she'd died in the fire that devoured the castle. Only he knew the truth, or part of it. He had watched her dissolve into dust in his arms, her final breath warm against his throat, whispering, "You were worth the darkness." He'd buried what little remained of her beneath the chapel ruins, beneath the same tree where she once sought the gods she never trusted. Every spring, the blossoms there bloomed red. Tonight, he came to the tavern for the first time in years, drawn by something he couldn't name. Maybe guilt, maybe hope. The door creaked open. The air changed. A young woman stepped in, slender, hood drawn low, her hands red from the chill. She moved with that same cautious grace Elowen once had, as though she belonged nowhere yet knew every corner of the room. When she lifted her hood, Varek's heart faltered. Her face wasn't Elowen's, but the eyes, there was something there. A shimmer of crimson gold that shouldn't exist. "Evening, sir," she said softly, voice melodic, familiar. "You'll be needing a refill." Varek stared, wordless. His throat closed. The wine glass trembled in his hand. The girl smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips that cut through the years. She poured his drink, the crimson liquid catching firelight. "Funny thing," she said absently, glancing toward the window. "Sometimes I feel like I've been here before, like someone left something unfinished." The tavern buzzed around them, laughter rising and falling, but for Varek, sound had narrowed to the heartbeat echoing in his ears. She turned to leave, humming a tune, a lullaby half forgotten, half remembered. The same one Elowen used to hum when she thought no one was listening. Varek rose. "Wait!" But she had already vanished into the back hall. He followed, boots silent on wood, breath shallow. The hallway was empty. Only shadows and candlelight remained. On the wall hung a mirror, old, cracked, dust-framed. For a heartbeat, the reflection wasn't his. It was her. Elowen's face, pale and radiant, eyes like dusk. Her lips moved, soundless. Then a whisper threaded through the air, soft as breath. "Run now!" The flame guttered out. When the light returned, the mirror was empty again. Only his reflection remained, haunted and hollow. Outside, thunder rolled. The rain began to fall. Varek walked out into it, hat tilted low, the whisper still echoing in his skull. He didn't run. He never would again. But as he passed the tavern window, something shimmered in the glass, two figures standing close. One mortal, one shadow. For a fleeting moment, they almost looked like lovers at peace. Then the reflection faded, leaving only rain and the faint scent of crimson roses. Ardent Hollow slept. The curse, they said, had ended. But beneath the chapel tree, the blossoms bled brighter that night, as if remembering.